May the words of my mouth and meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. They made long and eloquent prayers, and everyone knew it. They would pray at the corners of the street, so that people going and coming would see them. They had pieces of parchment sewn to their long robes on which some parts of the scriptures were written, so that people might infer that they were serious lovers of the law of God. They were very punctual and exact in their outward purifications, such that they washed when they came in and when they went out. They were so zealous for the traditions of their fathers and for the observation of their rites and ceremonies, insomuch that they kept so many more than were even commanded by God. For these reasons, the Pharisees were highly revered among the people. They had the uppermost places at the synagogues. They received great greetings in the marketplaces and were called of men Rabbi. In short, they had such a reputation for piety that a proverb among the Jews said that if there were but 2 men who were saved, one of them would have to be a Pharisee. And that proverb almost echoes what Christ said when he said, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will in no wise enter the kingdom of heaven. And it is also that same person, that Pharisee, whom Jesus describes in our parable this morning from Luke chapter 18. It's known as the parable of the Pharisee and the publican, or the Pharisee and the tax collector. And last year I mentioned that while there is no proof of it, that the publican in the parable has been portrayed by some as the tax collector turned apostle, St. Matthew. And this year, while we know it was not Christ's intent when he told the parable, we could certainly understand his teaching by looking at the life of St. Paul, both as the Pharisee and the tax collector, or the publican. St. Paul was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He was the cream of the crop in Jewish circles. Paul had defined himself like the Pharisee did in our gospel lesson. He looked on his own life and he could say, I have the perfect bloodline. I have the perfect education. I have the perfect appearance. If there was one who could stand before God, it was St. Paul. And Paul was certainly zealous for God. He was the one who sought to persecute and snuff out the Christians on behalf of God after Christ had ascended. He was present and he consented unto the stoning of the first martyr, St. Stephen. Acts chapter 8, verse 3 tells us, and this is before Paul's conversion, as for Saul, as he was called, he made havoc of the church, entering into every house and dragging off men and women, committing them to prison. Yet it is also this same self-righteous and zealous Pharisee who said just the opposite in our epistle lesson this morning from 1 Corinthians. Here in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, I am the least of the apostles, and I'm not worthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. St. Paul went from being the portrait of the quintessential Pharisee to being the lowly tax collector. As the publican prayed, God be merciful to me, so St. Paul declared, but by the grace of God, I am what I am. And I think it purposeful that this passage about St. Paul is coupled with the gospel lesson about that Pharisee and publican. For what better person is there to bring to real life the principles and truths that Christ teaches in that parable than St. Paul? I am what I am because of the grace of God. In another place and in another epistle, in Ephesians, St. Paul writes, for by grace you are saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. And this is what we are reminded of, and perhaps in some cases, forced to consider today. What makes us who we are? What defines us? Upon what do we stand? What do we consider important? Now, sin would have us say that we define life by tangible standards. And this is huge, especially when we're teenagers. Most teenagers are all about name brand. Their clothes have to be from a certain list of designers. Shoes have to be the expensive and most current ones. And whatever fad is in, well, that's what they need. But these things carry over into adulthood also. We have to have the right car. We have to have the right house, the latest and greatest in technology, and so on. I mean, consider the attention that one gets when their possessions or their achievements are on display. And consider again how those who don't have much or have not attained to great levels of achievement are often disregarded and disrespected. Sin would also have us define ourselves spiritually by standards that could be measured. How often do we come to church? How many Bible verses can we recite? How many sacrifices have we made for God? How much money have we donated to the church? And we like to define others that way as well, in an effort to see if they measure up. Do they compare to what I do? These are all quantifiable measures. And like being audited by the IRS, we have our ledgers open, every receipt prepared for the great auditor to inspect and say, all is in order. That's how sin has us define ourselves. We define ourselves by looking at ourselves as the Pharisee did in the parable. I give tithes of all that I possess. I fast twice a week. I'm not like other men. And the implication, of course, is that he is far better than them. Just as we feel much better as long as we are better than the person next to us. And it's also interesting to see that the Pharisee comes before God and doesn't petition him at all in his prayer. He doesn't ask for anything because there is nothing he feels he needs. He is perfect as he is. All he has is sufficient. All he does is right. Such is the view of himself. I lack nothing in myself, and nothing more could be added to me. Thank God I'm not like other people. We have a tendency to look at the externals, at that which flows from us. But Jesus, at least in this parable, and St. Paul in our epistle, has us look not to ourselves, but to God, at that which is extended to us. He would have us not look at the external, but the internal. He would have us not look at the works and the goods as the foundation of being the child of God, but upon the grace and the mercy of God who has called you and formed you into a child of God. I mean, consider the externals upon which we place so great a measure of worth. In the blink of an eye, it can all be taken away from us. In the brief hours of a hurricane passing over or a tornado whipping by, all can be destroyed. In the matter of minutes, the stock market can crash and fortunes be completely lost. In the course of a short mile, loved ones can be tragically lost in a car accident or the like. Likewise, in the course of time, that for which we tirelessly labored can be undone. One momentary lapse in judgment can destroy a reputation we spent years establishing. One wrong decision can easily lead to years of mistrust. And if there be any example that such is true, we need only turn to the man who was considered blameless and upright before God, yet suffered greatly at the hands of Satan. As the scriptures state, he was the greatest of all men in the East. Yet having all things and enjoying life, in the course of a day, he lost it all. 4 times during that devastating day, he received report one after the other that he lost all of his servants. He lost all of his livestock. He lost his 10 children. Job lost everything, all in one day. But Job could still declare, where after hearing such devastating news, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. How could Job declare that? I mean, indeed, there was grief on the part of Job. Indeed, there was questioning on the part of Job. Indeed, there was a natural frustration of anger on the part of Job. It's not that Job was indifferent to what happened. He was heartbroken. He was frustrated. He was uncertain. But while not understanding it, Job knew that God was still gracious. While not understanding it, Job knew who he was by the grace of God. Job could abide because he understood that who he was in his life was not defined by these things, but by the truth that he was a child of the Most High and that he had a Redeemer. In other words, he knew of the grace of God towards him, and nothing could take that away. That meant that he could have confidence. That meant he could endure. That meant that who he was as a child of God could not and would not change. It's similar in tone to St. Paul, who declares nothing can separate us from the love of God. And again, when St. Paul says that we learn to be content in any and all situations because God's grace was sufficient for him. That's the nature of one who lives according to the grace of God versus the works of man. The Pharisee that so proudly set his standards of excellence and achievements before God would live by those standards. And if just one tiny part of his touting were to fail, so would he. If he couldn't, for any reason, live up to what he established as his foundation, if he reduced his tithe, if he failed to fast twice a week, then all was undone. That's the nature of basing one's life, one's identity, and one's relationship with God upon works and externals. For as the scriptures say, if you fail in one aspect of the law, then you have failed in all. But thankfully, we hear St. Paul's words from Ephesians again ring in our ears. For by grace are ye saved through faith. And that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, and not of works, lest any man should boast. What is abiding? What never fails? What is the most important thing in life? Well, it's simple. It's the grace of God who has made us who we are. Let those words forever be your strong and your enduring foundation. But by the grace of God, you are who you are. Amen.